All right. Let me break this down for you as simply as possible, step by step, just like explaining to a young child. 1. The story begins. In 1905, a pandit, which is a person who knows a lot about old texts and knowledge, in the Tanjore district, a place in India, found an old manuscript, a book written by hand long ago. This pandit gave the manuscript to a man named R. Shamashastri, who was the librarian, someone who takes care of books at the Mysore Government Oriental Library, a library in Mysore, India. Mark 2. What was this manuscript? The manuscript was written in a language called Sanskrit. It had 168 folios, which are like pages. The text was written in a special writing style called Grantha script, an old script used for Sanskrit. The manuscript also had a commentary, an explanation, by a person named Bhattasvamin. It seemed that the person who wrote it, called a scribe, had taken care to write it properly, but had made a few mistakes. Number 3. What did the manuscript say? The manuscript was difficult to understand because it was written in a terse, aphoristic style. This means the sentences were very short and filled with meaning, but hard to follow. It had 15 books divided into different sections. It started with the symbol Om, a sacred sound in Hinduism, and a salutation, a kind of greeting, to two gods, Shukra, the teacher of the demons, Brihaspati, the teacher of the gods. Number 4. The big surprise. What was this book about? The manuscript was called the Arthashastra. It said that this Arthashastra was mostly put together from the teachings, lessons of many ancient teachers. The goal of this book was for the acquisition and protection of the earth, which means it was teaching how to rule and protect land. The book was written by someone named Kautilya. Kautilya is another name for Chanakya, an ancient Indian teacher, philosopher, and royal advisor. Number 5. Shamashastri's work. When Shamastri first saw this manuscript, he thought it was only a couple of hundred years old, but the text itself was much older. He realized that this was a very important and authoritative, respected ancient book on statecraft, how to rule and govern a country. 6. Spreading the knowledge. Shamashastri started translating, changing from Sanskrit to another language, the text in small parts from 1905 onwards. These parts were published in a journal called the Indian Antiquary. By 1909, he published the entire Arthashastra text, and in 1915, he made an English translation. 7. The world took notice. After Shamashastri's translation became popular, other manuscripts and commentaries, explanations of Kautilya's Arthashastra were found. The book was then translated into many other Indian languages like Bengali, Hindi, Gujarati, Kannada, Malayalam, Marathi, Oriya, Tamil, and Telugu. It was also translated into other world languages like German, Italian, Russian, and more English translations followed. 8. Modern work on the Arthashastra. Later, in 1960 to 63, a man named R.P. Kangle made a critical edition of the Arthashastra. A critical edition is a special version where they carefully check different copies to make sure it's as accurate as possible. Kangle's work also included an English translation and was based on many manuscripts and commentaries written in the early medieval period, a long time ago. Let's make this even simpler. Imagine someone finds an old treasure map. But it's not just any treasure map. It's a book that shows how ancient kings ruled their land. This book was old and hard to read, written in a secret language only a few knew. The person who found it, Shamashastri, realized this book could be very important because it showed the smart ideas used to rule many, many years ago. He shared what he found with others, and soon people all over the world started reading it. The book, called the Arthashastra, became famous because it was written by an ancient wise man named Kautilya or Chanakya, who lived more than 2,000 years ago and helped kings rule their kingdoms. Why is the Arthashastra important? It teaches how to rule a kingdom, how to protect land, how to govern people, how to manage money and resources, how to defend against enemies. It's like a guidebook for kings on how to run a country, written a long time ago, but people still feel today. Does that help explain things better? Let me know if you want more examples or any part clarified further. All right, let's break this down step by step in the simplest way, like teaching a young child. Chapter 1. The controversy about the Arthasastra's age. After the Arthashastra, the book, was found in the early 1900s, some people started to argue about who wrote it and when it was written. Some scholars, people who study history, thought it was written in the Maurya period, around 324 to 187 BCE. They believed it was written by Kautilya or Chanakya, the advisor who helped Chandragupta Maurya become king. Other scholars thought the Arthashastra was written much later, after the Maurya Empire. Number 2. The Maurya Empire, 324 to 187 BCE. The Maurya Empire was a big kingdom that started around 324 BCE and lasted until 187 BCE. Their empire was so huge, it covered almost all of India, and even extended to the northwest, places like modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. 3. Why dynasties are important. A dynasty is a family of kings or rulers who pass down power from one generation to the next. The Mauryas were one of the first dynasties to rule such a large part of India. Knowing the history of dynasties helps us understand the politics, who ruled and how they ruled of the time. But it doesn't tell us everything about how people lived their daily lives, their religion, or how the economy worked. 4. The Maurya Empire and history books. The Maurya period has many sources, different types of information, to tell us what happened back then. These sources are better than what we have from earlier times. 5. Different sources tell different stories. One source is the Puranas, which are ancient Indian texts that list the names of kings. Some Puranas say there were 13 Maurya kings who ruled for 137 years. Other Puranas say there were only 9 kings. This shows there is some confusion in the stories. There are also Jaina texts, like Hemachandra's Parishishth-Parvan. These mention that Chandragupta Maurya had connections with Jainism, an ancient religion that started in India. Number 6. Stories about Chanakya. A famous story about Chanakya, the wise advisor of Chandragupta, is told in a play called Mudra Rakshasa. This play was written by Vishakadatta in the 5th century CE, which was long after the Maurya period. The story is about how Chanakya helped Chandragupta defeat the Nanda king. But we don't know if this story is completely true, because it was written long after these events happened. 7. Buddhist stories about Chanakya and Chandragupta. Buddhist texts also tell the story of Chanakya and Chandragupta. These stories can be found in the Mahavamsa, which is an ancient book about Buddhist history. The Mahavamsa has a commentary explanation called the Vamsatapakasini, written in the 10th century CE. Haber 8. Other places mention Chandragupta. Some stories about Chandragupta can be found in Milindapanha, a Buddhist text, Mahabhashya, an ancient grammar text. 9. Maurya Empire's expansion to the south. The Maurya Empire expanded to the south of India. This is mentioned in a poem by a Tamil poet named Mamulanar. His poem gives us clues that the Mauryas tried to extend their power to the southern parts of India. Making it even simpler with examples. Imagine a big puzzle. The Maurya Empire is one piece of the puzzle, and each book or text we find gives us a few more pieces. Some pieces tell us about Chanakya helping Chandragupta become king, like in the play Mudra Rakshasa. Other pieces talk about how Chandragupta followed Jainism, like the Jaina texts. But because all these texts were written at different times and by different people, sometimes they don't match up, like the Puranas disagreeing on the number of Maurya kings. Summary. There's a debate about when the Arthashastra was written and who really wrote it. Some think it was during the Maurya period, 324 to 887 BCE, by Chanakya, while others think it came much later. The Maurya Empire was one of the biggest and most powerful empires in ancient India. We have many sources, texts, that tell us stories about the Mauryas, but sometimes these sources disagree or are not fully reliable because they were written long after the events. Does this make it easier to understand? Feel free to ask more questions if you want to know. Let's Let's break down this information step by step in the simplest way. 1. Ashoka in Buddhist texts. Ashoka was a king from the Maurya dynasty, and he is very important in Buddhist stories. In these Buddhist texts, Ashoka is shown as a great king who did many good things. Some of the texts that talk about Ashoka are Dipavamsa and Mahavamsa, both are Buddhist historical records. Ashokavana and Divyavadana, these tell stories about Ashoka's life, some of which may be legends or myths. Vamsa Pakasini, this is a commentary or explanation of another text that talks about Ashoka. These texts have stories about Ashoka that show him as a model king. Some of these stories may be exaggerated or legendary. Not all are facts. 2. Later stories about Ashoka. A Tibetan monk named Taranatha wrote about the history of Indian Buddhism in the 17th century. In his writings, he included some later stories about the Mauryas, but many of these stories were myths or legends too. 3. 2 important texts for Maurya history. To understand the Maurya Empire, especially Ashoka and Chandragupta Maurya, 2 important texts are 1. Kautilya's Arthashastra. This is a book on statecraft, how to rule a kingdom. It is believed to have been written by Kautilya, the advisor to Chandragupta Maurya. 2. Megasthenes Indica. This is a book written by a Greek ambassador named Megasthenes, who visited India during Chandragupta's rule. He wrote about what he saw in India. 4. Why these texts are important but problematic. These 2 books are important because they give us valuable information about the Maurya period. But they are also problematic, which means there are issues with them. Kautilya's Arthashastra is sometimes hard to understand, and scholars disagree on when it was written. Megasthenes Indica was written by a foreigner. Megasthenes was Greek, so some of what he wrote might be wrong or exaggerated because he didn't understand Indian culture completely. Example, think of it like a story about a hero where some parts are real, but other parts are like superhero myths. You need to sort out what's real and what's legend. Summary. Ashoka is presented as a great king in many Buddhist texts like the Dipavamsa and Mahavamsa. Some stories about him might be legends, especially the ones written much later. 2 important books for understanding the Mauryas are Kautilya's Arthashastra, about ruling a kingdom, Megasthenes Indica, written by a Greek who visited India. Both texts give important information, but they have some issues that make historians question parts of them. Does this explanation make sense? Feel free to ask if you want to dive deeper part. Sure, let's break it down step by step. What is the Arthashastra? 1. Arthashastra. It's an old book written by Kautilya. It's like a guidebook for running a state or a country. Think of it like a very detailed instruction manual for rulers. 2. Artha. This word means material well-being or wealth. In simple terms, it's about making sure people have what they need to live well. In the book, Artha is considered more important than Dharma, spiritual well-being, and Kama, pleasures, because you need material wealth to support the other 2. What does the Arthashastra talk about? 1. Purpose. The book explains how to manage and protect a country. It focuses on how to get and keep resources, which people need for their livelihood. 2. Structure. The Arthashastra is divided into 15 parts. First 5 parts talk about managing the country from inside, like setting up rules and handling day-to-day affairs. Next 8 parts discuss how to deal with other countries, like forming alliances or handling conflicts. Last 2 parts cover various other topics that don't fit into the first 2 categories. Who wrote the Arthashastra? 1. Author. The book is traditionally believed to be written by Kautilya, also known as Chanakya or Vishnugupta. He was an important advisor to Chandragupta Maurya, a historical Indian king. 2. Traditional view. Many scholars believe this book was written in the 4th century BCE. This is supported by verses in the text and other old writings that mention Kautilya and his work. Key points to remember. Arthashastra is about managing a state or kingdom. It emphasizes the importance of material well-being, artha. It is divided into sections that cover internal management, foreign relations, and various other topics. The traditional belief is that it was written by Kautilya in the 4th century BCE. Example to simplify. Imagine you have a big toy collection. To take care of it. 1. Internal management. You organize and clean your toys. 2. External relations. You trade or borrow toys with friends. 3. Miscellaneous. You might fix broken toys or get new ones. The art guide for rulers on how to do these tasks for a whole country, not just toys. If more questions or need further explanations, feel free to ask. Let's break it down in the simplest way possible and explain every idea step by step. Traditional view versus new questions. 1. Traditional view. People used to believe Kautilya, also known as Chanakya, wrote the Arthashastra. He was a very important person in the court of Chandragupta Maurya, a powerful king. The book was thought to be written around the 4th century BCE, very old. 2 verses in the Arthashastra say that Kautilya is the author. This is why many people believed it. Why people are questioning this view? Over the years, people started asking questions about whether Kautilya really wrote the Arthashastra. Here are the main reasons why. 1. Verses might be added later. Interpolation. Some people think that the parts of the book that say Kautilya wrote it might have been added later. They say that maybe these parts were not in the original book, but were put in later to give credit to Kautilya. Another possibility is that when the book says Kautilya's Arthashastra, it might just mean the ideas were taught by Kautilya, not necessarily written by him. 2. No mention of Kautilya in other important books. Patanjali's Mahabhashya is a very old book about grammar, how language works, written after Chandragupta Maurya's time. This book talks about the Mauryan dynasty and Chandragupta, but it doesn't mention Kautilya. Some people say, if Kautilya was so important, why is he not mentioned in this book? But remember, Patanjali's book is about grammar, not history, so it might have left out political figures like Kautilya, because that wasn't the focus. Megasthenes Indica is a book written by a Greek ambassador who spent time in Chandragupta's court. In this book, Megasthenes also doesn't mention Kautilya. However, Megasthenes' book only survives in parts, meaning we don't have the whole thing. So maybe the part where Kautilya was mentioned is lost. Another argument. Scholar versus real politician? Some people say, it looks like the Arthashastra was written by a scholar, a person who studies and teaches, not someone who was actively involved in running the country. But this argument doesn't convince everyone, because even scholars can write books on real-world topics. For example, a scholar can study how to build houses and write a book about it, even if they aren't a builder themselves. Size of the state in Arthashastra. 1. Small or medium state? The book seems to describe a state that is small or medium in size, not a huge empire like the Maurya Empire, which Chandragupta ruled. Some people use this to question if Kautilya wrote the book because they think, if Kautilya was advising Chandragupta, who ruled a big empire, why does the book describe a smaller state? 2. Imperial ambitions, dreams of a big empire. On the other hand, the Arthashastra also talks about big dreams of conquering, taking over the whole Indian subcontinent. It talks from the point of view of a Vijigishu, someone who wants to conquer other lands and become a big ruler. The book also gives detailed plans for organizing a large kingdom or empire. For example, it describes how the government should be structured, who should do what. It talks about giving big salaries to officials, which would make sense in a large, rich state. This suggests the author had a large, well-established state in mind, even if some parts of the book seem to describe smaller states. Summary in the easiest way. People used to believe Kautilya wrote the Arthashastra to help Chandragupta rule a big empire. Now, some people question this, because the verses saying Kautilya wrote it could have been added later. Kautilya is not mentioned in some other important books from that time, like Patanjali's Mahabhashya or Megasthenes Indica. The book seems to describe a smaller state in some parts, not a large empire like the Maurya Empire. However, The Arthashastra also talks about conquering large areas and gives detailed plans for how to manage a big empire, which fits with Kautilya helping Chandragupta Maurya. In short, the debate is ongoing. Some think Kautilya wrote it, and others think it was written by someone else later. Both sides have good points. Does that make sense now? Let me know if you have more questions.
Alright, let's break this down into very simple language, step by step, so it is easy to understand. Comparing to books, Arthashastra and Indica Arthashastra. This is a book about how a king should rule. It talks about statecraft, that means how to manage the government, the army, the city, and the kingdom. People believe it was written by Kautilya, Chanakya, who helped Chandragupta Maurya become a king. Indica. This is a book written by Megasthenes, a Greek man who visited India. He worked in the court of Chandragupta Maurya, and he wrote about what he saw in India. People are comparing these two books. Some people looked at the Arthashastra and Megasthenes' Indica and said, these books are very different. For example, they noticed differences in fortifications, how cities are protected with walls or forts, city administration, how cities are managed, army administration, how the army is organized, taxation, how the king collects money from the people. Argument 1. Could they belong to different times? Because these two books are so different, some people say, the Arthashastra must have been written much later, not during Chandragupta's time. They argue that since Megasthenes was alive at the same time as Chandragupta, and his book, Indica, doesn't match the Arthashastra, the Arthashastra must be from a later period. Why this argument doesn't work? Some scholars disagree with this idea. They say that Megasthenes wasn't always accurate in what he wrote. For example, Megasthenes said that all land in India belonged to the king, but that wasn't true. He also said that there were no slaves in India, which wasn't correct. He even said that Indians didn't know how to write, but we know they did. Also, the Indica is not completely available today. We only have bits and pieces of it that were saved by later writers. Why can't we use Indica to judge Arthashastra? Because Megasthenes' work, Indica, has many mistakes and only fragments survive. Scholars say that it's not a good source to compare with the Arthashastra. So, we cannot say the Arthashastra is from a later time because it's different from the Indica. What about the Mauryas? People noticed that the Arthashastra doesn't mention the Mauryas, Chandragupta's family, or Patliputra, Chandragupta's capital city. But this is not a problem. Why? The Arthashastra is a theoretical book, which means it gives general advice for how to run a kingdom, not specific details about one king or empire. It talks about how a king should rule, not about how any specific king ruled. The traditional view, Kautilya wrote it during Chandragupta's time. Some scholars, like Kangle, say that Kautilya probably did write the Arthashastra during the Maurya period, the time of Chandragupta Maurya. Here are some reasons why. Writing style. The writing style of the Arthashastra is older than other famous texts, like Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra, a book about love and relationships, Yajnavalkya Smriti and Manu Smriti, ancient law books. Ajivikas. The Arthashastra mentions a group of people called the Ajivikas as an important religious sect. The Ajivikas were most powerful during the Maurya period, so it makes sense that the Arthashastra was written then. Sangha polities. The book talks about Sangha polities, which were small republics that existed during the time of the Mauryas. This also supports the idea that the book was written in that period. Agricultural settlements. The Arthashastra discusses how to create large farming communities, agricultural settlements, which was happening a lot during the Maurya period. Administration. The book's description of how to organize a government doesn't match any other historical dynasty after the Mauryas, so it fits the Maurya period best. Who was Kautilya? Scholars believe that Kautilya, also known as Chanakya, had different names. Vishnugupta was his personal name. Kautilya was his Gotra name, a family or clan name. Chanakya, son of Chanka, was his father's name, patronymic name. Some scholars think that Kautilya wrote the Arthashastra after he was insulted by the Nanda king and before he joined Chandragupta Maurya to help him become king. Simplifying it further with examples, think of the Arthashastra like a guidebook for kings. It's a bit like a recipe book. It tells you how to make a successful kingdom, but it doesn't talk about a specific king or time period. Just like a recipe book doesn't talk about a specific chef. Megasthenes' Indica is like a travel blog. Megasthenes came to India and wrote what he saw. But just like some travel bloggers get things wrong or don't have the full picture, Megasthenes also made mistakes in his descriptions. Key takeaway: just because the Arthashastra is different from Indica doesn't mean it was written at a different time. The Arthashastra is a theoretical book, and Megasthenes didn't get everything right in his observations. There are good reasons to believe that Kautilya wrote the Arthashastra during the Maurya period, when Chandragupta Maurya ruled. Does this explanation help? Let me know if you want more examples or clarification.
Let me break this down for you step by step in the simplest way possible. Who was Megasthenes? 1. Megasthenes was an ancient Greek person. He was sent to India as an ambassador, a representative, by Seleucus Nicator. Seleucus was a king who ruled parts of the Hellenistic world, the areas influenced by Greek culture after Alexander the Great. What was the Indica? To Indica is the name of the book written by Megasthenes. It describes his observations of India when he visited the Maurya court. He wrote about the people, culture, and politics of India. Megasthenes and the Maurya kings. 3. During the Maurya period, when Chandragupta Maurya and Bindusara ruled, trade and relations between India and the Western world, like Greece and Rome, grew. Greek and Roman people started mentioning Indian kings. They referred to Chandragupta Maurya as Sandrocatus and his son Bindusara as Amatrochates. Megasthenes' role. 4. Megasthenes was first in the court of Subertios, who was the governor of Arachosia, modern-day Kandahar in Afghanistan. After a treaty, an agreement was made between Chandragupta Maurya and Seleucus Nicator, Megasthenes was sent as an ambassador to Chandragupta's court. Megasthenes visits to India. 5. Arrian, another Greek historian, mentions that Megasthenes may have even visited King Porus, another famous Indian ruler. But we don't know how often or how long Megasthenes stayed in India. His understanding of Indian society was likely limited because, as a royal ambassador, he probably only interacted with high-status people and didn't travel much. What did Megasthenes write about? 6. In his book, Indica, Megasthenes wrote about the cities he saw, including Pataliputra, which he called Pelambothra, the kings like Chandragupta and Bindusara. His descriptions of Indian culture, society, and politics are some of the earliest written by someone from the Western world. Summary. Megasthenes was a Greek ambassador who visited India during the rule of Chandragupta Maurya. He wrote a book called Indica about his experiences in India. His knowledge of Indian society might have been limited because he probably didn't travel much beyond the royal court. Example. Imagine you are sent to another country but only get to visit the king's palace and talk to royal people. You wouldn't know much about the regular people or how they lived, right? This is similar to how Megasthenes' experience in India was probably limited to the royal court. Let me know if you need more details. Let's break this down step by step in simple words and an easy to understand way. Megasthenes and his book. 1. Megasthenes was a Greek ambassador who traveled to India during the Maurya period. 2. He wrote a book about his experiences and observations of India called Indica. 3. Unfortunately, the book didn't survive, meaning we don't have the actual copy today. How do we know about Indica? 1. Even though the Indica book was lost, fragments or pieces of it are found in later writings by other historians and scholars. 2. These fragments were used by Greek and Roman writers to describe India. 3. Some of the most important historians who preserved Megasthenes' work were Diodorus, Strabo, Arrian, and Pliny. Who were these historians? 1. Diodorus Siculus. He was a historian from Sicily, born in the 1st century BCE. He wrote a big book called Bibliotheca Historica, meaning historical library. Sadly, most of his work is lost, and we only have parts of it today. In his surviving books, he described Alexander the Great's campaigns in India using information from Megasthenes' Indica. 2. Strabo. He was a geographer and historian, born around 63 BCE in Pontus, a region in West Asia. He wrote a famous book called Geography, and in it, he included a description of India in Book 15, again using Megasthenes as a source. 3. Arrian, Flavius Arrianus. He lived around 96 to 180 CE and was a statesman, soldier, philosopher, and historian. His book Anabasis was about Alexander's campaigns. Arrian also wrote his own version of Indica, where he used Megasthenes' work and added details from another scholar, Eratosthenes. He also described a journey made by Nearchus, a commander under Alexander, down the Indus River. 4. Pliny the Elder, Gaius Plinius Secundus. He lived around 23 to 79 CE and was a Roman scholar. He wrote a large book called Naturalis Historia, Natural History, which covered many topics like geography, animals, and plants. In this book, he also cited Megasthenes' observations about India. 5. Claudius Aelianus. He was a Roman writer who lived in the 2nd-3rd century CE. He wrote a book called On the Peculiarities of Animals, where he also mentioned Megasthenes' descriptions. Summary. Megasthenes' Indica was a very important book about ancient India, written by a Greek ambassador. Even though Indica is lost, later historians like Diodorus, Strabo, Arrian, Pliny, and Aelian used pieces of it in their works. Thanks to them, we still have some knowledge about Megasthenes' observations of India. Example. Think of Megasthenes' Indica like a recipe book that is lost. But later, other chefs who used the book remember some of the recipes and write them down in their own books. Even though the original book is lost, we can still know some recipes from these later chefs. Let me know if this helps or if you have more questions. Certainly. Here's a step-by-step breakdown of what Megasthenes wrote about India in his book Indica and how later Greek writers used this information. What Megasthenes' Indica described. 1. Geography. India's size and shape. He talked about how big India is and its general shape. Rivers, soil, and climate. He described the important rivers, the type of soil, and the climate weather of India. 2. Plants and animals. Animals. Greeks were really interested in Indian animals. Megasthenes described animals like elephants and monkeys. Horse training and elephant hunting. He also mentioned how horses were trained and how elephants were hunted. 3. Society and government. Administration. He wrote about how the Indian government was organized and how society was structured. Social structure. He discussed different classes and roles in Indian society. 4. Cultural and religious similarities. Gods and worship. Greeks saw similarities between Indian gods and their own gods. For example, they compared Indian deities to Dionysus and Heracles, which they thought were like Vasudeva Krishna. Philosophies. They noticed similarities between Indian religious ideas and their Greek thoughts about the world and the soul. Mar 5. Idealized views. Farming and war. Megasthenes wrote that farmers in India were not involved in wars. Slavery and theft. He noted that there was no slavery and that theft was rare in India. Mistakes and misunderstandings. 1. Economic practices. Money lending. Aelian, a later writer, said that Indians didn't borrow or lend money with interest. This might not be true. 2. Technology and culture. Writing and metalworking. Strabo reported that Indians didn't know about writing or how to work with metals. He also said they didn't drink wine, except for religious ceremonies. How later Greek writers used Indica. Diodorus, Strabo, Arrian, and Pliny were Greek and Roman writers who mentioned Megasthenes' Indica. They often focused on the most interesting or exotic parts of Megasthenes' work, leaving out the less exciting details. They wrote for an audience that was curious and wanted to be entertained as well as informed. Summary. Megasthenes Indica gave a broad view of India, including its geography, animals, society, and culture. Later Greek writers used parts of Indica to describe India, but sometimes got things wrong or exaggerated. They were interested in making India sound fascinating, sometimes made errors in their descriptions. This overview should help you understand the essence of Megasthenes' work and how it was received and used by later writers. If you have more questions or need more details, just let me know. Certainly. Here's a step-by-step breakdown of what Megasthenes wrote about India in his book Indica and how later Greek writers used this information. What Megasthenes Indica described. 1. Geography. India's size and shape. He talked about how big India is and its general shape. Rivers, soil, and climate. He described the important rivers, the type of soil, and the climate weather of India. 2. Plants and animals. Animals. Greeks were really interested in Indian animals. Megasthenes described animals like elephants and monkeys. Horse training and elephant hunting. He also mentioned how horses were trained and how elephants were hunted. 3. Society and government. Administration. He wrote about how the Indian government was organized and how society was structured. Social structure. He discussed different classes and roles in Indian society. 4. Cultural and religious similarities. Gods and worship. Greeks saw similarities between Indian gods and their own gods. For example, they compared Indian deities to Dionysus and Heracles, which they thought were like Vasudeva Krishna. Philosophies. They noticed similarities between Indian religious ideas and their Greek thoughts about the world and the soul. Mar 5. Idealized views. Farming and war. Megasthenes wrote that farmers in India were not involved in wars. Slavery and theft. He noted that there was no slavery and that theft was rare in India. Mistakes and misunderstandings. 1. Economic practices. Money lending. Alien, a later writer, said that Indians didn't borrow or lend money with interest. This might not be true. 2. Technology and culture. Writing and metalworking. Strabo reported that Indians didn't know about writing or how to work with metals. He also said they didn't drink wine, except for religious ceremonies. How later Greek writers used Indica. Diodorus, Strabo, Arrian, and Pliny were Greek and Roman writers who mentioned Megasthenes' Indica. They often focused on the most interesting or exotic parts of Megasthenes' work, leaving out the less exciting details. They wrote for an audience that was curious and wanted to be entertained as well as informed. Summary. Megasthenes' Indica gave a broad view of India, including its geography, animals, society, and culture. Later Greek writers used parts of Indica to describe India, but sometimes got things wrong or exaggerated. They were interested in making India sound fascinating, sometimes made errors in their descriptions. This overview should help you understand the essence of Megasthenes' work and how it was received and used by later writers. If you have more questions or need more details, just let me know. Let's break it down step by step. Understanding Ashoka's inscriptions. 1. Discovery and initial confusion. Who discovered? A scholar named James Prinsep found and read Ashoka's old inscriptions written on stone. Problem. At first, Prinsep didn't know which king the inscriptions were talking about because they used special titles instead of names. Devanamiya means beloved of the gods. Piyadasi means he who looks on auspiciousness. 2. Finding the clues. Ancient texts, books called Dipavamsa and Mahavamsa, mentioned these titles and helped identify the king as Ashoka. Name found later. Later, inscriptions were found with Ashoka's name written on them, which helped confirm that the inscriptions were about him. These were discovered in places like Maski, Udagolam, Nittur, Gujarat. Languages and scripts used. 1. Main languages and scripts. Prakrit. This is the language used in most of Ashoka's inscriptions. Brahmi script. This is the script writing system used to write Prakrit in most inscriptions. 2. Other languages and scripts. Kharoshthi script. Some inscriptions found in places like Mansehra and Shahbazgari used this different script. Greek and Aramaic. Bilingual Greek-Aramaic inscription. Found in Shari Kuna near Kandahar in Afghanistan, this inscription used both Greek and Aramaic languages. Aramaic inscriptions. 2 found in Lagman, East Afghanistan. 1 found in Taxila in modern-day Pakistan. Prakrit Aramaic bilingual. Some inscriptions used both Prakrit and Aramaic. These were found in Lampaka, Kandahar. Summary. Ashoka's inscriptions, originally confusing due to unclear titles, but later confirmed to be about Ashoka through additional discoveries. Languages and scripts. Most used Prakrit and Brahmi script. Some used other scripts and languages, showing how Ashoka's empire interacted with different cultures. I hope this explanation clarifies things in a simple and easy way. Let's break down the explanation of Ashoka's inscriptions in even simpler terms, with more details. Who was Ashoka? Ashoka was a famous king of ancient India who ruled the Maurya Empire about 2,300 years ago. He became very powerful, but after seeing the suffering caused by wars, he changed his heart and decided to promote peace and kindness instead. To share his new ideas, he had messages carved on rocks, pillars, and caves across his empire. These carvings are known as Ashoka's inscriptions. What are inscriptions? Inscriptions are writings carved into something hard, like stone or metal. Ashoka used inscriptions to communicate his ideas to his people. Since there were no books or internet in ancient times, inscriptions were a good way to share important messages with many people. Types of Ashoka's inscriptions. Ashoka's inscriptions come in different types, depending on where they were written and how important the messages were. Here's a simple breakdown. 1. Major rock edicts. These are big messages carved into large rocks. There are 14 sets of these major rock edicts. The messages on these rocks were the most important, covering Ashoka's ideas on how people should behave, how to treat others, and how to be kind and fair. 2. Pillar edicts. These messages were carved on tall stone pillars, tall, standing columns of stone. There are usually 6 pillar edicts, but in some places a 7th one was added. These pillars were set up in different parts of Ashoka's kingdom, so that more people could see them. 3. Minor rock edicts. These are smaller messages carved on rocks. They are thought to be the earliest inscriptions, which means Ashoka started with these messages before moving on to bigger ones. 4. Minor pillar edicts, similar to the minor rock edicts, but these were carved on small pillars. Number 5. Cave inscriptions. These messages were written inside caves. They could be smaller, but still carried important messages. When were these inscriptions made? Minor rock edicts, Ashoka's earliest messages. These were made at the beginning of his mission to spread his ideas. Major rock edicts. These were made later, after the minor rock edicts. Pillar edicts. These came last after the rock edicts. In some inscriptions, Ashoka mentions events and dates them by saying how many years had passed since his Abhisheka, his coronation ceremony, the day he became king. This helps historians understand the timeline of these messages. What did Ashoka talk about in his inscriptions? Ashoka didn't just boast about his victories like other kings. Instead, his inscriptions were full of his ideas about how people should live better lives. Here are some things he talked about. 1. Dharma. This means doing the right thing. Ashoka wanted people to live honestly, be kind to others, and be responsible. 2. Nonviolence. After seeing the horror of war, Ashoka promoted peace and nonviolence. He encouraged people not to harm each other or animals. 3. Respect for all religions. Ashoka believed that all religions should be respected. He didn't want people to fight over beliefs. 4. Kindness to animals. Ashoka was also very concerned about the treatment of animals. He passed rules to protect them from unnecessary harm. 5. Health and welfare. Ashoka wanted to improve the health and well-being of his people. He ordered the building of hospitals and wells for people and animals. Why are Ashoka's inscriptions special? Ashoka's inscriptions are different because they show his personal thoughts and feelings. It's like hearing the king speak directly to the people. Not just a king's boast. Many kings of the past would only talk about their victories and how great they were. But Ashoka used his inscriptions to teach kindness, peace, and good behavior. For example, he didn't just say, "I am powerful." Instead, he would say things like, "Everyone should live in harmony and take care of each other." Extra details. Why did Ashoka use rocks and pillars? Back in Ashoka's time, there was no paper or printing press. If Ashoka wanted everyone to know his ideas, he needed to put them on something strong and permanent. Rocks and pillars were perfect because they last for a long time. Different languages. Most of Ashoka's inscriptions were written in Prakrit, which was a common language at the time, and in a script called Brahmi. In some regions, they were written in Kharoshthi script. Ashoka even had some inscriptions written in Greek and Aramaic for people living in the northwest part of his empire, like in today's Afghanistan, where those languages were spoken. To summarize, Ashoka used inscriptions on rocks and pillars to spread messages of peace, kindness, and fairness to his people. His inscriptions are special because they reveal his own thoughts, unlike the usual boastful inscriptions of other kings. He wrote these messages in different places and languages, so that as many people as possible could understand and follow his teachings. Sure, let's break this down into simple parts so it's easy to understand. Who was Ashoka? Ashoka was a king in ancient India around 250 BCE. He ruled a large empire and is famous for spreading Buddhism and promoting peace. What are inscriptions? Inscriptions are writings carved into stone. Ashoka had many of these created to share important messages with his people. What do we know about Ashoka's inscriptions? 1. We don't know how many. We aren't sure how many inscriptions Ashoka made because many have disappeared over time. 2. Traveling monks. 2 Chinese monks, Faxian and Xuanzang, traveled in India many years later. They talked about seeing pillars and inscriptions in places where we can't find them today. 3. Location of inscriptions. Rock edicts. These are mostly found at the borders of Ashoka's empire. Pillar edicts. Most are in North India, except for a piece found in Amaravati. Minor rock edicts. These are spread out more widely, especially in the Andhra Karnataka area, southern India. 4. Along trade routes. Many inscriptions were placed along old trade and pilgrimage routes. For example, one is found at Sanchi, a famous Buddhist site. What do the inscriptions say? Dhamma. Most inscriptions explain a concept called Dhamma. Dhamma means living a good and moral life, following the teachings of Buddha. Ashoka's efforts. The inscriptions describe how Ashoka worked to spread Dhamma and how successful he felt he was in this mission. Connection to Buddhism. Some inscriptions show Ashoka's close relationship with Buddhist monks, called the Sangha. They show how he wanted to support Buddhism. What insights do we get? The inscriptions give us a unique view of how Ashoka saw his job as a king. He believed his main role was to help people live well and be kind, not just to rule. There aren't many details about his government or economy in these inscriptions. They focus more on moral teachings. Other inscriptions. There are later inscriptions that mention Ashoka and his family. For example, the Junagarh Girnar inscription from 150 CE talks about a lake built during Ashoka's reign. This lake was started by his grandfather, the Chandragupta Maurya. Shravana Belgola. Later inscriptions from the 5th to 15th centuries CE in Karnataka mention a monk named Chandragupta and a Jaina saint named Bhadrabahu. Some people think they may have connections to the Maurya king Chandragupta, but this is debated among historians. Half summary. Ashoka was a king who spread Buddhism through stone inscriptions. We know some inscriptions are lost, and others are mostly in North India. The inscriptions talk about Dhamma, Ashoka's efforts, and his connection to Buddhism. They don't focus much on details about his government or economy. Other later inscriptions mention connections to Ashoka and his family, but some ideas are debated. Example to understand better. Imagine you are a teacher and you write messages on a big board for your students. You tell them to be kind, work hard, and help each other. If some of those messages are erased or lost over time, it can be hard for people later to know exactly what you said. That's like what happened